Welcome to our mobile app AMA. We have two members of our mobile team here. I'm gonna let you guys introduce yourselves and kind of tell a little bit about what you do and what your team is about.
I'm Dan Murrell. I'm the engineering manager of the mobile team here at BigCommerce. I started about 4.5 years ago and they hired me as a senior software engineer. So I was originally the first hire. As we've kind of grown over time and added more members, now I've become more like their manager, although I do still get a chance to participate in the code pretty regularly.
And I'm Chris Ruddell. I'm the lead engineer on the mobile team. I started about a year after Dan did. I've primarily been working on the Android app. Dan has done a lot with the iOS app, but now we've got a whole team built around us, and it's the best team that I've ever been part of.
We struck gold when we found Chris.
Oh, that's really nice, you guys. I didn't expect it to be so nice. Okay. All right. We will dive right into the questions. The first one is, how important is my mobile app versus my desktop app?
Some people think about mobile apps as almost a replacement for desktop apps, and we kind of view that a little bit differently, that it's more complementary. You hear terms thrown around like second screen, mainly with TV watching, but that's really true with store management as well on an e-commerce platform. The full feature set of being able to manage your store is on the control panel on the desktop experience. We know we can't do that in the mobile app. We have limited space that we're working with, but what we can do is provide a really superior experience on a mobile device for things that you would do on the go. So if you're taking a trip somewhere and you need to go in and change the status of an order, or you're at a conference and somebody says, hey, can I place an order with your business? Pull up the mobile app on your phone and be able to do that order. So it's things like that that we feel like the app shines because it can complement the experience of the desktop.
What makes a good mobile app, just in general?
Knowing what the limitations are of the platform that you're using will help you really design a good mobile app. And you should always start with the user experience, very early on, if not first. Like Chris said, we complement a very complex product that can do everything if you sit down at a desk or at a laptop. But when you're on the go, when you just have a limited amount of time, or you have the limited amount of space that you get on a mobile app, understanding those constraints and doing your design and your building, keeping those constraints in mind, I think that's what really makes a good mobile app, because a good user experience really means a good mobile app.
What's the major difference between desktop experience and mobile experience that developers should keep in mind when they're building an app?
We have to really pay attention to what are the primary functions and features that a user is going to need or want. We have to make those decisions ahead of time and really hone in on them given the limitation of space. But also there's other limitations, such as the way that you interact with the application. On a desktop, you've got a full keyboard and a mouse. On the phone, you're using your finger for everything. So the amount of text you can type is a lot more limited. But you can also do things like dragging and dropping. So it can provide a richer experience. One example of that is being able to look up a product through the barcode. The mobile app, we can access the camera, scan the barcode, and immediately pull that product up.
It's a whole lot easier to take a quick photo of a product with your phone than it is to turn your laptop around and use that webcam.
On a website, you might have a couple of different browsers that you have to test against, but the hardware where the code is running is all under your control. If you need to update that website, you just change it on the server. With the mobile app, it is a distributed system to the nth degree, because every person has their own hardware. Think of it as their own server instance running the application. So we've got tens of thousands of instances of our app out there. And if we need to update, it's up to the users to actually download that update. So we have to really kind of think about the changes that we make, knowing that many users may not get those changes, or it may take weeks or months for them to.
Is a mobile-friendly web app fine, or is it best to build out a website and an app for a mobile app separately?
A mobile-friendly website, that's usually pretty good if the people who design it put the effort into making sure that it does the functions that they need to do on the desktop, which is essentially, in our case, everything. Where you run into problems is when you're designing for a website, the design language is just whatever your design language is. When you're designing for mobile app, platforms really have a very well thought out, carefully thought out design language that everybody fully understands. On a desktop, you can have a reference manual or a guide or something like that to help people kind of figure out what to do. But on a mobile app, because of all that design language that's essentially trained the people that use those phones, how to use their phone, how to scroll a list, how to select something, how to delete things, how to switch between tabs, all of those things, you get all that standardization so that people can just pick up a phone that's running your app and almost intuitively know how to use it. Having that familiarity on the mobile platforms and being able to make use of that mostly comes in a native app. A web app, they can try to mimic it, but it's a lot more work in there. But it also means that you also have to think about your design really well to make sure that it kind of keeps to the spirit of the design language of the platform too.
Which tech stacks do you recommend for building a mobile app? And also, I'm curious, what tech stack do you guys use?
At BigCommerce, we decided fairly early on to create the mobile app using native technologies, meaning that for the iPhone, we will use native iPhone application using Swift, on Android using Kotlin. But you could also choose to go with more of a hybrid approach. We had a really early iteration that was a cross-platform React Native technology. And something like that can work great if it's a fairly simple app and you're on a team that doesn't have the resources to develop two completely separate applications. It was great for getting kind of a proof of concept out the door for us. But we realized pretty quickly the complexity that we have. We were just kind of fighting the system and eventually said, let's do this properly because that's what our merchants expect. In terms of some of the additional tech stacks within native apps, like I said, on iOS, we're using Swift as a language. When we began this, we were doing everything in what's called UIKit, which is kind of the old way of building views. And just within the last couple of years, Apple has pushed this new kind of design language called Swift UI. And so we've been starting to build all new screens doing that. Similar on Android, we began developing it using the Kotlin language, using the old Android Vue framework. And then recently they came out with this Jetpack Compose, which is very similar to Swift UI. It's just doing it in a more of a language type of way to build those views, but gives you nice benefits like having previews instantly on your computer before you deploy it to an app. So that's kind of the decisions we've made. If you're going with a web app, there's several different types of technologies you might look between there.
Do iOS or Android apps perform better?
You should see our Slack. We have Android versus iOS emoji flying back and forth all the time. I'm mostly kidding there. We have fun with it. I would say that they both perform very similarly. You can absolutely have two different apps on each platform perform very different from the other, but we take a lot of great care in making sure that our performance is very similar across the board.
Is it important to have both?
Absolutely, it's important to have both. We have found as we've grown more internationally that while in the United States and other similar Western countries, there's a lot more iOS adoption. Once we get outside the borders, Android totally dominates. So we would be shutting out a lot of users one way or the other if we just went with one.
My mind goes to how does it perform on the App Store? How many people are using the app? How does it perform in terms of allowing users to meet their needs on the go? We've seen within our own data more iOS users than Android, but because we're starting to really push the globalization, we kind of expect that to balance out here pretty soon.
You guys were really peaceful during that, I'm sure. Difficult. What are the best practices and like industry standards when it comes to building a mobile app?
Swift UI and Compose are definitely the standard that is quickly being adopted by the industry. Even apart from that, if you were to not use those newer technologies, the underlying principles that they bring, kind of that reactive style of programming, has absolutely kind of taken hold. So in the past, you might have had a whole bunch of callbacks and listeners that you would attach everywhere. And now most apps that are being developed, if you're starting a new app, takes a more reactive approach where one button that you tap on the screen may fire an event that may trigger another view to update, but that button doesn't tell the view to update. It's the system in the background saying, hey, I'm going to do some logic, and now I'm going to send an event that view can listen to. So that has been really important for us because it allows us to kind of keep the code a lot cleaner. We can have one team member working on one view and the logic that it uses, while another team member might work on a different part of the app, and they may talk to each other and need to kind of keep updated, but they can work independently because of that reactive nature.
Both of these platforms are very generously supported by both Apple and Google. And so they make lots and lots of developer resources available, and not just developer as in the code part of it, but also the design part of it as well.
Chris, I think you just mentioned that we're pushing globalization a little more now. How do you make your apps work in other languages?
When we as a company made the decision a while back to start to localize the entire platform and make it available in different languages, it was a lot easier task for our team than other teams because the mobile apps, by their very nature, are set up for that. What I mean by that is that the framework that you build an Android app or an iOS app on already has support for putting in your different translations. We only had an English file that had all those strings, but it wasn't hard to dump in a Spanish file or a German file. And then the device controls what language gets displayed by the user going into their device settings.
In this case, we're really piggybacking off of a decade or more of work that both Apple and Google have done. So these devices are in every country, every language, every square inch of the world at this point. So they've already kind of jumped over those hurdles of not just localizing for languages, but also currency, time, measurements, you name it. If it can be expressed in more than one way, Apple and Google have already worked out the solution of that. The main thing that we had to do was just to make the decision from line one of the code, hey, we're going to go ahead and do all the work now, even though we're not adding new languages yet. We're going to do all the work now to make sure that if we show a dollar amount for a product, like a total on an order or something like that, that we do it in a localizable way so that in the future, which is actually now, if this is an order placed in Germany, it will be rendered in the native currency there.
After we added in the first 3 or so languages, we spent quite a bit of time going through each screen to make sure that words weren't being cut off, that things weren't being pushed down the screen in such a way that it looked like a horror view. So you do have to take care and really kind of combing through your app when you do that.
For us, languages like German or Scandinavian languages, which have really long words oftentimes, they were like our acid test. But the good thing about it is every time we added another language, we were just kind of building off of the testing that we had done in the previous one. So by about the 4th or 5th language we added, we didn't have any more UI issues to fix.
I was in my head thinking, oh my gosh, I'm sure they ran into some German word that was 30 characters long.
I took it in college, so I knew what to expect.
What tools do you use to make the apps consistent between iOS and Android?
One of the most important things I would say is the consistency of design and user experience. So to that end, we rely heavily on our design team to plan out what the screens are going to look like and taking into account the differences between the platforms. So for instance, the text box that you would display in order to type in some type of user input, whether it's an email address or what, those look visually different on iOS and Android. That's because they each have their own kind of design style that the system uses for things like that. We could have forced those boxes to look identical on both, but it wouldn't feel natural to the user. So we really spend a lot of time talking about, okay, what is it that we need to make sure is consistent between the two, and what is it that we want to be particular to each from a design standpoint. We have different websites and online tools that we use for things like that, such as Figma. We also have tools to be consistent in terms of the quality of the app. So we have bug reporting tools. The app crashes, we get a notification and it'll tell us where to look in the code for that. And that just is really kind of helping us make sure that if we have a bug, we get it taken care of quickly, but also if there's a bug on one platform, it very well may be on the other one. So we don't really have tools for developing a feature on Android, for instance, and copying it into iOS. We've got to develop those independently, but we are able to use the shared learning across the teams.
I'm actually really impressed at how well our design team has been able to develop designs that can be made so consistent between the two platforms. In the past in my career, I've definitely worked on apps that were very significantly different, whether on iOS or Android, just because of basic functionality like the navigation system are very different between the two. Our designers, they do a lot of work on the front end figuring these things out so that when it gets to the point where we're actually pulling this work into our sprint and starting to develop it, most of the problems have already been thought out.
Do I, a developer, need to think about when I'm going to take payments in my app or I'm going to charge people to use my app?
Apple and Google, they want to take a cut of money that you make in these apps. So that's one of the first considerations that you need to make. Generally, it's 30%. They do have some programs where they can cut it down after a year. Like if it's subscription, like a long-term subscription, they'll cut it down to 15. But for just an average developer, there's always going to be a little bit of a take from the platform, which is totally fine. I mean, they're giving you this opportunity to reach hundreds of millions of potential customers. You can adjust your pricing to account for that if you need to.
There are ways of being able to monetize your work and not have to pay Apple and Google if you can do it outside of the app itself. So if your main accounting system is set up on your website and your app just logs into that, that's one way of kind of protecting your bottom line. The other way you can deal with this is by deciding what it is you're charging for. If it's for some kind of digital content or feature of the app, that gets pretty tricky because Apple and Google are going to want to take a piece of that. But if it's for selling a physical product, for instance, which many of our merchants do, then they say, we know that it's not fair to take 30% margin off of something that you only are making maybe a 2% margin on. So they made the decision from the very beginning that when you're selling physical products, you do not have to give a portion of that to Apple or Google. The payments that we support in our app is for exactly that. If our merchant is selling one of their goods, they can take payment through the app, process that payment on our secure server, receive that money, and none of that will go to Apple or Google.
Now, this is kind of like just a higher level question about the BigCommerce app. What has been the history of the mobile app at BigCommerce and what is on the horizon?
When I first started back in 2018, BigCommerce had an app, but it was one that they had essentially commissioned. And so it didn't have a permanent team that was here to support it. So they made a decision to have like an official mobile app that was fully supported and to start building a team around it. I was essentially the first hire for that. We started growing the team, and that allowed us to be able to add bigger and more expansive features. Like Chris said a little while ago, it was originally a React Native app, but we found out like pretty quickly within a few months, the designs and the ideas that we have long-term for this are way too complex for us to be able to build that in React Native, which is essentially a hybrid technology that will let you do, for the most part, an iOS app and an Android app from a single code base. We were always having to make specific modifications on one side or the other to approximate native functionality that you just kind of got for free if you were just building a native app. And so that's the reason why we made that decision to pivot and build two separate native apps. Chris, you want to talk about some things on the horizon?
Right now, we have the ability to create a draft order and be able to save that and it can even generate a URL to be able to go right to your checkout page on your web page. So customer calls up and says, hey, I would like to make an order. I'm not quite ready to pay for it, but can you kind of help me get this set up? You as the merchant go on the app, start adding products to the cart, add the customer information, and then save it. You can get that URL that will go straight to the checkout page and send it to that customer. We've also started working on trying to allow you to complete the order and take that payment. So I alluded to this earlier with the payment stuff. On Android, we have that working, and on iOS, that is something that is in development and will hopefully be releasing soon. Another thing is we're looking at how can we bring more analytics into the app. Right now, we have this chart showing your orders and revenue over the last week, month, year, but there's a whole lot more information about your store that you might be interested in. And if you go to our control panel, there are pages and pages of these analytics. So we're looking to see which of those makes sense to show in a mobile view and how can we get that in.
Are there any other cool things that you can do with the BigCommerce mobile app that might not be obvious to users?
We put a lot of effort and work into figuring out what is the most essential features that anybody would want to do. If they make sense for mobile, how can we make it efficient in a way for them to do it really quickly? If your warehouse manager sends you a text and says, hey, we're running out of X, if you're sitting at a red light, maybe you can quickly bump up some inventory to be sent from some other location to that warehouse. Chris probably has lots of other ideas too.
I kind of think about the use cases of how somebody might use our mobile app. And one of those that comes to mind is they're taking a phone call from a customer, and let's just imagine this is a customer that has been a long-time customer of yours and something happened with their order. And they call up and they're upset. Hey, I've given you lots of money over the years, lots of business. You need to make this right. And meanwhile, you're sitting in an airport and I'm not in front of a computer. How can I help you? You pull out the mobile app and you say, okay, first thing I'm going to do is refund this order. So I pull up the app, open up the order details, and refund it right from there. Or you might say, you know what, I want to make this right. We will let you keep the products that you've received, but I'm going to give you some store credit. So I pull up your customer information in the app and immediately go in and give you store credit. Those are things that are not maybe immediately obvious when you're using the app, but are great features that can really help the merchant out.
Sounds like something you need it when you need it, and you know when you need it. The last couple questions I have are about the API. So how do you ensure an app is performant, and should you use REST or GraphQL?
A lot of times on a mobile app, the users obviously don't have a wired connection. They may not have a high-speed connection. It could be that they're on 4G or even 3G in roaming mode, but still need to be able to do something. We made the decision, let's not download orders until they start to page through them. Let's not download every customer from your customer book, only download the ones that you're looking at as you kind of scroll through the list or if you search for something. Another way is you can cache some of that data. You could save it off to a database on the device. This is something that we're potentially adding in down the road, is the ability to kind of save off things that we know you might use later on so that we don't have to go to the server every time to download that. In terms of which API technology to use, that's going to be dependent on the server technology that you're talking to. BigCommerce, we built our public APIs using REST from the very beginning, but we've recently started adding in GraphQL support. So a lot of the storefront APIs are now in GraphQL. The administrative APIs, being able to manage your store, those are starting to be built in GraphQL. And we're waiting until kind of that gets a little bit more mature. It's still kind of in a beta phase on the store management APIs. But once those become more fully available, we'll be looking at pulling them into the mobile app. The use case that I like to think of when it comes to GraphQL is loading up the order detail page. So when you look at the details of one particular order, you have customer information, you have order information, you've got catalog information. You might have a list of products that are in that order, but You might have to go to the catalog APIs to get product images to display. What's the current price? Is there a sale price or things like that? The GraphQL would allow you to basically make one query to get all that information at once. That can be a very performant way of handling data. But if it's a list of data, or if you're making bulk updates of information, GraphQL may or may not be the best choice there. REST might be an easier way.
I would say for at least 90, maybe even 95%, we're using the same public APIs that any third-party developer or partner would be using. There are a couple of internal APIs that we use because maybe we need some kind of different access or authentication to our system or something like that. But by and large, we're essentially the kind of like the equivalent of a tech partner or a third-party developer working within BigCommerce, working with all those public APIs. If we publish documentation saying, you make this call with these inputs, you get these results back, we're kind of testing those out ourselves. And we're probably one of the biggest consumers within BigCommerce of our public APIs. We get to work with those and have a hand in how they develop.
What are some things to look out for when adding coupons and discounts to a checkout cart?
When you're adding a coupon, you've got to know the coupon code. So if your system has coupon codes that are very similar, make sure you type it in correctly. On our mobile app, if the user is doing it, say a draft order, and they add a coupon to that order, we display what that coupon is for. So we first go out to the API and get the coupon details and display it, rather than just blindly trusting them because they may have mistyped something. We want to make sure that we make it clear to them what coupon they're applying before they save that order. The other thing is make sure you know how your coupons and discounts work. There's a lot of complex rules that go into those that you can set up on the control panel. For instance, is it applied before tax or after tax? Is it a percentage of the product or a percentage of the entire order? Make sure you really understand what the rules are that you've set up before you start trying to apply coupons to an order.
You don't want them getting too little or too much of a discount.
Definitely not too much.
All right, that was our last question. Thank you very much to Chris and Dan, and we're out of here.